Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Great Victorian Cheese Smuggling Scandal. It was the year 1853, and while much of the British Empire was consumed with grand tales of exploration and conflict, a quieter drama was unfolding in the shaded corners of market towns across the English Midlands. The story begins not with high treason or political scandal, but with cheese specifically, the coveted and highly taxed wheels of Stilton and Cheddar that had become the target of a complex, slow-moving network of rural smuggling. In this time of rising tariffs and rigid food regulation, the Board of Inland Revenue had found a new target in the dairy economy. Cheese, especially those aged varieties that traveled well and fetched high prices in urban markets, became a taxable commodity of interest. As consumption in London increased, so too did the state's desire to benefit from the humble wheel. But out in the market lanes of Derbyshire and Northamptonshire, this new tax was met not with vocal protest but with a quiet, methodical defiance. Farmers, cheesemongers, and even vicars found ways to subvert the system, smuggling cheese across parish and county lines, often disguised as bricks, footstools, or in one case, organ bellows. To understand how cheese became a crime, one must first understand the complex network of toll roads, border patrols, and weight-measuring inspectors that had taken hold of 19th-century Britain. In 1849, Parliament passed the Perishable Goods Oversight Act, which, while intended to regulate meat and milk, included vague language that would come to haunt the cheese trade. The act granted local excise officers the authority to seize dairy goods not properly registered or labeled for tax purposes. Enter the smugglers. Unlike the dramatic smugglers of the Cornish coast with their barrels of rum and black powder pistols, the cheese runners of the Midlands were mostly pensioners, schoolteachers, and children paid in crusty bread to carry small wheels of cheese hidden in basket bottoms. A favorite technique involved concealing rounds of cheddar beneath laundry, stitched into petticoats, or, remarkably, transported on funeral carts. One infamous case occurred in 1851, when the Reverend Edwin Stokes of a sleepy chapel in Uppingham was caught at the village border transporting ecclesiastical supplies. These turned out to be 12 wheels of lightly aged Stilton, hidden in an organ crate intended for delivery to a choir competition. The Reverend claimed he was unaware of the contents, but records from the Rutland Excise Office noted he had been warned 6 months prior about the unregistered passage of dairy substances. The scandal would have ended there, a footnote in bureaucratic ledgers, were it not for the diligence of one Miss Penelope Raxley, a customs officer's daughter with an affinity for ledger checking and cheese. At just 19, Penelope had already earned a quiet reputation for identifying inconsistencies in shipping manifests at the Melton Mowbray toll gate. She noticed something odd in late 1852. While the official logs showed a decrease in licensed cheese exports from the Midlands, London merchants were mysteriously reporting an increase in their stock. This mismatch sparked her curiosity, and with her father's reluctant blessing, she began compiling detailed reports from multiple toll stations. Her investigations uncovered a network of inconsistencies: cheese weights not matching manifest totals, odd declarations of goods such as stone-cut goods, which upon further examination were suspiciously soft and pungent, and a recurring reference to wheel shipments with no further description. It wasn't long before a pattern emerged. A group of traders centered around a nondescript barn in Rutland were coordinating shipments of untaxed cheese to urban buyers. These shipments were timed with postal deliveries to confuse tollkeepers and were often carried in modified mailbags with false bottoms. The barn, later referred to in court as the Dairy Exchange, became a hub for nightly activity that no one, save Miss Raxley, seemed interested in. The government, slow to act but eager to appear competent, launched what they called Operation Mold Watch. It was, by most accounts, a series of poorly coordinated inspections across rural cheese-producing parishes. Few arrests were made, but the operation did result in several crates of confiscated cheddar being rerouted to government kitchens. As one official wrote dryly in his diary, "It seems the only outcome of our efforts is better-fed clerks." Still, the shadow network of cheese smugglers persisted, adapting, learning, and even, according to one intercepted letter, developing their own crude code language involving dairy metaphors. For instance, double cream meant a high-priority shipment, while gone hard indicated that the local toll officer was suspicious. By the end of 1853, Penelope Raxley had managed to link the shipments to at least 7 major market towns, and yet no large arrests had been made. Her report, stretching 86 pages, was filed with the Home Office, but received little attention. Bureaucracy, it seemed, was more interested in preventing forged tax stamps than chasing wheels of cheddar through the countryside. Still, one couldn't help but wonder, how had a young woman with no official authority uncovered so much? And why was the government hesitant to act on her findings? Was it mere inefficiency, or was there something else beneath the surface of this sleepy scandal? As the days shortened and the fogs of late 1853 settled over the Midlands, the cheese smuggling operation grew more confident. Rural England, with its interweaving network of hedgerows, muddy paths, and slow-moving administrative oversight, proved the perfect breeding ground for quiet defiance. But beneath the calm churn of the countryside, discontent was rising along with the profits of illicit dairy dealers. Penelope Raxley, still working unofficially from her cramped back office beside the Melton Mowbray toll gate, found herself overwhelmed by a growing mountain of correspondence. Farmers were writing to her anonymously, some confessing to smuggling cheese to pay debts, others offering information in exchange for leniency. It seemed that nearly every village from Stamford to Leicester had at least one participant in what locals had begun to call the cream run. The ingenuity involved was, in its own way, admirable. Some smugglers stitched wheels of cheese into the lining of horse-drawn carriages. Others repurposed old beer barrels, hollowing them out to carry cheddar wrapped in waxed linen. A widow from Oundle had trained her geese to carry packets of camembert in tiny satchels tied to their legs, claiming that the constables never question a goose. But this rustic theater masked the seriousness of the operation. By late October, Penelope's estimates suggested that over 9,000 pounds of untaxed cheese had moved through the Midlands in a single month. This represented not only a significant loss in excise revenue, but also a fundamental undermining of the state's authority. Frustrated by the lack of response from the Home Office, Penelope reached out to the Society for Honest Trade, a largely ceremonial civic group headquartered in Lincolnshire. The society was best known for publishing pamphlets on grain measurement standards, but Penelope suspected that within their archives might be records of similar fraud schemes from earlier decades. There she met a peculiar ally, Mr. Harold Finch, a retired toll administrator with a mild stutter and a remarkable memory for smuggling schemes. Over mugs of weak tea in the society's drafty reading room, he introduced her to past scandals involving soap bricks, counterfeit lead weights, and even a brief but bizarre trade in falsified shoe polish made from mashed parsnips. Finch believed the cheese trade was not just a cottage crime, it had become a decentralized cartel. He introduced the concept of distributed markets to her, noting that cheese shipments rarely followed the same path twice and always relied on temporary laborers with no fixed addresses. "You're chasing fog," he said. "Unless you find the central buyer, the churn will just keep spinning." Penelope took this advice to heart. She began digging through merchant registries in London and Liverpool, looking for wholesalers whose records didn't align with legal supply lines. There, she found something interesting. A recently established firm, Grentham and Bull, which reported receiving nearly double the volume of cheese as its licensed suppliers could possibly provide. The firm had a spotless public reputation, but further investigation showed curious gaps in its ledger trail shipments listed from towns that had no known dairy production. She suspected Grentham and Bull was laundering illicit cheese, purchasing smuggled wheels at a discount, and reselling them with forged certificates of taxation. But how to prove it? She wrote to the local parish council in Grentham-on-Lee, posing as a curious buyer. When they responded, the tone was polite but evasive. No tour of the warehouse were allowed, and inquiries about sourcing were deflected. That was enough to convince her. She made plans to travel there herself. Meanwhile, back in Rutland, the dairy exchange had grown cautious. The smugglers suspected, rightly, that someone was onto them. Meetings were reduced, codes changed, and one of the barns was even burned, though whether by accident or as a tactic to cover records remains unclear. It was during this time that Penelope, now operating with quiet support from a few reform-minded MPs, made her visit to Grentham-on-Lee. Posing as the daughter of a northern cheese vendor, she was allowed into the periphery of the Grentham and Bull warehouse. What she found was both mundane and telling: a labyrinth of wooden crates, none properly marked, all smelling strongly of aging dairy. One particular detail stood out: a clerk marking crates not with standard excise tags, but with red wax seals stamped with symbols she did not recognize. She discreetly copied one into her notebook. Later, in conversation with Mr. Finch, the old man squinted at the drawing and mumbled, "That's not from London. That's the old Minster Guild mark, scarce seen since the 20s. The Minster Guild had been disbanded decades earlier for operating a price-fixing ring in the coal trade. Their symbol appearing on cheese crates suggested that someone was using long-forgotten guild channels to funnel illicit goods under the radar. Penelope had stumbled upon more than a group of rogue cheesemakers. She was now looking at a multi-layered, interregional conspiracy that stretched from rural dairies to urban warehouses, and perhaps even deeper into the administrative crust of British trade itself. But even as she prepared her report and quietly gathered testimonies, the smuggling operation adapted again. Cheese began arriving in clay pots mislabeled as pig fat. One courier was caught transporting 40 pounds of Cheshire cheese in a hollowed-out church lectern. And then came the most unexpected twist: an unsigned letter delivered by hand, simply reading, "You've done well enough, Miss Raxley, but curds sink faster than proof. Mind the churn." Who had sent it, and what exactly did it mean? In the dim light of an early February morning, with frost resting thick on the hedges and cart wheels creaking in protest against the cold, Penelope Raxley stood once more before the threshold of Grentham and Bull. Her second visit, now under the auspices of a newly deputized role granted to her by an increasingly curious member of Parliament, bore little resemblance to her first. Gone was the disguise of a merchant's daughter. This time, she carried a folder bearing the seal of the Parliamentary Inquiry on Dairy Tax Compliance, a seal that even the most discreet clerk knew better than to question. It had been nearly 2 years since the cheese tax had been enforced with any vigor, and yet this scandal had refused to go sour. Penelope's compiled report now extended beyond her initial 86 pages. With the assistance of Harold Finch and several defrocked clerks turned informants, she'd pieced together not only the smuggling routes but the entire mechanism that had made them flourish. A shadow network of former guild members, corrupt toll collectors, disillusioned farmers, and urban traders, all participating in a quiet war against bureaucratic overreach. Inside the warehouse, stacks of sealed crates bore no official markings. The red wax insignia, once mysterious, was now a familiar stamp of subversion. Some crates bore faint chalk notations: B1 white, M2 curd, D3 hard stock. These weren't inventory marks used by honest dairies, they were smuggler shorthand. Finch had shown Penelope their equivalents in his collected notebooks. B1 denoted high-fat butter stock used for laundering funds. M2 was mid-grade cheese suitable for falsified taxes. D3 meant the good stuff aged hard cheeses meant for upscale urban tables. Despite these discoveries, arrests were few. Penelope had uncovered an operation too diffuse and decentralized to be easily crushed. In many ways, that was its genius. Like the waterways that irrigated England's fields, the smuggling network adapted to every stone and obstruction, carving quiet new channels. So she changed tactics. Instead of pursuing the couriers and barnkeepers, she turned her attention to the bureaucracy itself, specifically the stamp division of the Board of Inland Revenue. There she found curious anomalies in the ordering of dairy excise stamps. Requests for bulk stamps had surged in 3 counties without a corresponding rise in declared cheese output. Someone inside the system was funneling legitimate stamps to cover illegitimate cheese. It wasn't hard to trace it to a low-ranking clerk named Alfred Tunstall, whose sudden acquisition of a fine horse and renovated home in Lincoln suggested income well beyond his station. When confronted, Tunstall crumbled, admitting he'd been paid by a dairy concern with London ties to order surplus stamps and resell them in the countryside. Yet even this breakthrough failed to result in significant crackdowns. Penelope's detailed affidavits, sketches of smuggling compartments, and intercepted communications were read aloud in parliamentary sessions, met with raised eyebrows, polite laughter, and eventual dismissal. The consensus was simple. Yes, it was illegal, but it was only cheese. Still, the scandal continued to ripple. The publication of Penelope's findings in the Leicestershire Morning Courier ignited debate among tax reformers and rural advocates alike. Farmers argued that the tax burden forced them to choose between survival and legality. Urban consumers discovered the luxury cheeses they'd been enjoying were, in fact, criminal contraband and irony that seemed to amuse the upper classes more than concern them. As public interest grew, the pressure mounted on Parliament. The Perishable Goods Oversight Act, originally passed with little fanfare, was quietly amended in late 1854. Dairy goods were declassified as taxable perishables, and excise enforcement was scaled back dramatically. The revenue loss was deemed acceptable in the face of mounting public ridicule. With the law relaxed, the smuggling network slowly dissolved. The barns emptied. The fake crates disappeared. Grentham and Bull continued trading, though under new management and a new name. And the red wax seals, once a symbol of the underground dairy trade, vanished from the landscape like mist under a rising sun. But what of Penelope? Though she was never formally awarded any honors, her name became a quiet symbol of bureaucratic vigilance. She was offered a modest position with the Board of Trade but declined. Instead, she returned to Melton Mowbray, where she married the local librarian and wrote occasional columns under the pseudonym The Wheel Watcher. Her later essays, collected under the title Curds and Customs, became a minor cult favorite among students of odd British history. As for the cheese, it continued to flow, though now untaxed and out in the open. There are still rumors, of course. Some say that in the deeper shelves of forgotten grocers or in the backrooms of old inns, you can still find crates marked D3. Some say the wax-sealed cheese never really disappeared, only went further underground. Others whisper of a cheese guild that continues to meet once a year under cover of a livestock auction in Shropshire. But those are stories, half true and half aged. What remains undeniably real is this. A nationwide crime ring built on dairy, defied tax collectors and reshaped laws, all without a single violent act, all through wheels of cheese, linen, and stubborn resistance to unjust levies. And one must wonder, in an empire built on rules and trade, was it really the cheese that broke the system? Or was it the quiet, deliberate churn of those willing to bend the rules of a bloated bureaucracy one wheel at a time? Story 2. The Turnip Tax Riots of Rural Kent. The year was 1838, And while Queen Victoria had only recently ascended to the throne, change was already stirring in the muddy fields of southeast England, not in parliament halls or royal courts, but in the furrows of farmland, beneath rows of humble turnips. In the villages of rural Kent, turnips had long been a staple crop. Not glamorous, not profitable in any grand sense, but reliable. Used to feed livestock, supplement poor harvests, and bolster the diets of common laborers, the turnip had earned its place in the peasant economy. Its cultivation required little coarse earth, rainfall, and persistence. Its taxation, however, would require far more. Following a severe economic downturn in the 1830s, Parliament introduced a set of measures intended to stabilize the agricultural economy while securing revenue from the lower classes. One such measure was the supplementary root produce, levy, a mouthful of policy jargon that meant, in essence, a tax on root vegetables grown in surplus and traded informally. The justification was buried in an 87-page agricultural reform bill, which stated that the unchecked barter and sale of root crops in local markets encourages economic disparity and endangers tax consistency within the counties of Kent, Sussex, and Surrey. To most villagers, it translated to one clear reality. If you grew turnips beyond your family's immediate need, and you sold or even traded them, you owed the crown a portion of that value. This tax, unremarkable by urban standards, struck the agricultural heartlands like a plow through stone. The very idea of taxing something as unremarkable as a turnip, a food grown as much for winter survival as for trade, felt absurd, even insulting. The villagers of Ham Street, Smarden, and East Brabourne were the first to voice concerns. In handwritten petitions, they pointed out that turnips were often used to pay debts in kind, not in coin. Taxing them, they argued, would disproportionately impact the poorest families, who depended on informal exchange systems. The government's response was both predictable and indifferent. Officials claimed that enforcement would be mild and unobtrusive, and reassured the public that inspectors would use discretion and common sense. In practice, it was quite the opposite. By late autumn of 1838, traveling inspectors, colloquially known as root men, began appearing at village markets, counting turnips, weighing carts, and issuing fines for what they deemed excessive harvest quantities. In the town of Wittersham, a farmer named Hugh Farrow was fined 2 shillings for bringing 84 turnips to market rather than the permitted 50. His protest, that 30 were for his neighbor's pigs, was dismissed. Tensions simmered. One early act of resistance came not in the form of violence, but of mild absurdity. In the village of Pluckley, locals began disguising turnips as cabbages, painting them green and reshaping their tops with shears. A local curate wrote that the market stalls looked like fields of lumpy sham vegetables, sold with straight faces and stiff backs. By winter, the protests grew bolder. Anonymous pamphlets were left in church pews and tied to fence posts, bearing slogans like, "You tax our roots, we'll root out your tax." From stable to soup, the turnip shall not serve the crown. One morning in December, the Wigmore incident unfolded. A procession of donkeys, each wearing a taxman's hat and carrying baskets of turnips marked "Property of the Queen," was led silently through the town square, drawing laughter and applause from onlookers. No one claimed responsibility. But the taxmen were not amused. In early January 1839, the government increased enforcement. More inspectors were deployed, this time with support from local constables. Confiscations became common. Barrows were seized, fields were measured, fines stacked up. The result was predictable. Resentment turned to defiance. The first documented turnip riot occurred in Rawlvenden. Villagers, warned of an approaching inspection team, preemptively dumped piles of turnips in the village green and set them alight. Witnesses described it as a bonfire of blandness, watched in silence, no one speaking as the vegetables burned. What followed was a string of minor but frequent disturbances. Tacksmen were pelted with spoiled root vegetables. Cart wheels were sabotaged. In one case, a mock court was held in a barn where a scarecrow dressed as a tax official was tried and convicted of vegetable tyranny. Yet despite the comedic elements, the strain on villagers was real. With fines mounting and markets under scrutiny, many turned to underground trade networks, late-night exchanges of root vegetables done by lantern light in hedgerows or behind barns. Local midwives and millers became intermediaries in these exchanges, trusted not just for their work, but for their discretion. The government responded with pamphlets urging calm and cooperation, warning of the serious nature of agricultural disobedience. In return, the villagers produced their own. One featured an illustration of a turnip with a crown, weeping into a ledger. What makes this episode remarkable is not the violence. There was very little, nor the scale. Only a handful of counties were directly affected, but the sheer persistence of quiet rebellion. Ordinary people, farmers, cobblers, housewives, schoolboys had drawn a line at the taxation of something as humble as the turnip. They had done so not with muskets or mobs, but with mockery, creativity, and communal resolve. And yet the tax remained, and the inspectors still came. By the spring of 1839, the Root Rebellion was entering its second season. But now the Crown was not just facing angry farmers, it was facing what one constable called a population united by farce. So the question loomed, quietly but unmistakably. Would the government double down on enforcement or finally admit defeat in the face of so many turnips, jokes, and burning piles of root vegetables? By the spring of 1839, it was evident to all but the most blinkered bureaucrat that something peculiar was taking root in Kent. What had begun as scattered grumbling among agricultural workers had now grown into a stubborn form of collective protest, organized, sustained, and imbued with a dry, pastoral wit that left local authorities unsure whether to be amused or alarmed. The turnip tax, once viewed as a minor legislative adjustment tucked into broader agricultural reform, had triggered what one unnamed Home Office clerk described as a low-grade but persistent rural insubordination. The Crown had hoped that rural compliance would follow the usual pattern, quiet acceptance followed by habitual payment. Instead, it received poetic pamphlets, vegetable effigies, and a network of barter that outmaneuvered even the most diligent inspector. What truly puzzled officials was the methodical, almost bureaucratic nature of the resistance. It wasn't chaos, it was something more unnerving, a grassroots mimicry of government process, repurposed for defiance. In the town of Betherston, villagers established the Parish Root Committee, an informal assembly that met weekly in the back room of the local alehouse. Its purpose: to record vegetable yields, track inspector movements, and distribute surplus produce to families who had been fined into hardship. Minutes were taken. Rolls were assigned. One meeting opened with the words, "We, the undersigned, do hereby agree not to register any turnip unless said root is legally classified as ornamental." Elsewhere, networks formed around the local chapel bells. 3 rings at dusk meant inspectors had been spotted entering the village. A long peal followed by a short one signaled a confiscation. In Smuggling, a farmer constructed a hand-cranked pulley system that dropped sacks of turnips into a dry well behind his barn whenever tacksmen approached. The resistance soon acquired a figurehead, Mrs. Edna Ratting, a 64-year-old widow from Rawvenden who became something of a folk heroine. Edna, known previously only for her rhubarb cordial and her formidable opinions on poultry hygiene, rose to prominence when she marched into the Tenterden tax office with a single turnip nailed to a board and a sign reading, "One root, one revolt." She refused to pay her fine. When threatened with arrest, she asked if they planned to chain her to the scales in the market square and measure her crimes by the pound. The incident was widely retold, often with embellishments, and Mrs. Ratting soon found herself the subject of impromptu songs and crude but affectionate sketches in market stalls. Her notoriety inspired others. Turnips began appearing in odd places stuffed into post boxes, arranged in cryptic patterns outside courthouses, or carved with faces and placed on fence posts as if on quiet, expressionless patrol. Meanwhile, inspectors found their jobs increasingly difficult. One officer in Charing reported his horse's feed bag had been filled with pickled turnip slices. Another in Ashford claimed to have opened what appeared to be a legal produce crate, only to discover it contained 150 carved wooden replicas, each painted and lacquered, but entirely inedible. The Church of England, ever cautious, issued a short pastoral letter discouraging further root-based rebellion, noting that while taxation was a burden, mocking officials with tuberous symbols did little to nourish the soul. The villagers responded by delivering a basket of turnips to the local vicar, each one labeled with a Bible verse referencing food, humility, or unjust rulers. By midsummer, the Crown's patience was wearing thin. A proposal was submitted to deploy military assistance to certain highly non-compliant parishes. This was quietly dismissed by cooler heads in Parliament, who argued correctly that sending troops to enforce a vegetable tax would make for humiliating headlines in the Times. Instead, the government appointed a special commissioner to investigate, Sir Leland Draycott, a former colonial administrator with experience in difficult provincial matters. Draycott arrived in Kent dressed impeccably and carrying a silver-topped cane. He began with a series of public hearings, inviting local villagers to air grievances. The sessions were cordial but unproductive. In one now famous hearing, Draycott asked a farmer from Biddenden why he refused to register his turnip yield. The farmer replied, "Because, sir, it is my belief that if you let them tax turnips today, they'll tax the rain tomorrow." Draycott remained composed, but his subsequent report was notably critical not of the villagers, but of the law itself. He observed that the tax disproportionately penalizes subsistence farmers, encourages deceitful behavior, and has been enforced with little practical oversight or rural sensitivity. This was a diplomatic way of saying that the Crown had made a mess of things. Still, Parliament hesitated. Repealing the tax outright would signal weakness, yet enforcement had become a farce. Revenue gains were paltry, costs of enforcement rising, and public mockery growing. Satirical cartoons now appeared in London depicting ministers chased by giant anthropomorphic root vegetables. Amid the indecision, the villagers continued their slow, deliberate resistance. In Newenden, farmers held a mock auction in which invisible turnips were sold for imaginary currency, all witnessed by a representative from the London Agricultural Times, who described it as a theatrical performance of admirable stubbornness. By autumn, the tide began to turn. A group of moderate MPs introduced a repeal amendment, citing Sir Draycott's report and the growing burden on already struggling agricultural communities. A parliamentary debate ensued, notable for one speech in which an opposition member asked, "Shall we truly be a nation that governs by weight of root?" The debate ended without a vote, but momentum was shifting. Mrs. Ratting, when informed of the possibility of repeal, reportedly said only, "Let the roots be free, and the people shall stew in peace." But there remained a lingering question, unresolved and quietly unsettling. If a tax so small could generate such organized, peaceful revolt, what might happen if a greater burden were imposed? By the close of 1839, the autumn rains soaked the fields of Kent, and the turnips, stubborn and swollen, lay in long, neat rows, silent symbols of both sustenance and sedition. In the fields, nothing seemed different, but beneath the muddy soil of routine, the roots of quiet rebellion had grown deep. The supplementary root produce levy, still technically in effect, had in practice become unenforceable. Officials in Ashford, Canterbury, and Maidstone began to report declining morale among excise officers. One particularly defeated clerk noted in his logbook, "I have spent the day asking elderly women how many turnips they own. There must be more useful things for a man of arithmetic to do." The government faced a dilemma. The tax, designed for order and revenue, had instead eroded public trust. Worse, it had inspired an enduring local identity, a kind of proud rural defiance, wrapped in humor and wrapped again in the paper-thin skin of a root vegetable. Despite public embarrassment, ministers debated fiercely behind closed doors. Some argued that repealing the law would set a dangerous precedent, that if the government could be cowed by farmers with signs and stunts, it would embolden every disgruntled class in Britain. Others insisted the tax had already failed. It had cost more to enforce than it had raised and turned the countryside into a stage for mockery. Then came the final nudge. In early November, a Royal Agricultural Society report compiled by neutral observers was leaked to the press. It included damning statistics. Nearly 40% of all excise fines issued under the root levy had gone unpaid. Of those, over half had been written off to avoid conflict. Confiscated turnips accounted for less than 0.02% of national revenue. But more importantly, the report acknowledged something that no prior document had dared to say aloud. This episode reveals the limitations of state influence over subsistence culture. The root tax is, in every practical sense, unenforceable. Public support for repeal swelled, fueled by satirical illustrations and broadsheets from as far afield as Birmingham and Manchester. Cartoons showed turnips giving speeches in Parliament, passing laws against unfair taxes. One particularly popular image featured a noblewoman in full regalia being weighed on a produce scale beside a basket of vegetables. The caption read, "Which of these feeds the nation?" The repeal came quietly, folded into a broader Agricultural Simplification Act passed in March 1840. No apologies were issued. No reference was made to Mrs. Edna Radding or the parish root committees. The levy was simply omitted in the revised tax tables, replaced by a short note. Provisions relating to minor surplus produce, withdrawn following policy review. But in the villages of Kent, the repeal was not overlooked. The following week, a symbolic harvest festival was held in Rolvenden. No officials were invited. Instead, villagers paraded turnips dressed in miniature regalia, some in wigs, others wearing mock badges of office. Children sang new verses to old songs. Mrs. Radding, now 65 and still full of vinegar, led a speech in the square. She held up a single, polished turnip and declared, "This is not just food. It is freedom, nobby, bland, and ours." It became known locally as the Great Kentish Root Festival, and would be celebrated in various forms for the next several decades, sometimes with nothing more than a basket of turnips left outside the local tax office as a gentle reminder. In time, the turnip tax faded from official history books. It was too minor, too absurd, too embarrassing. Yet in Kentish folklore and later in academic studies of rural protest, it became a case study in how ordinary people, armed only with wit and unity, could quietly overturn state policy without a single shot fired. More than a protest against taxation, it was a resistance to bureaucratic overreach. A declaration that even the smallest communities, with no wealth or title, could wield influence through persistent absurdity. And perhaps that's the lesson, hidden in the dirt and the humor. That the strength of a society lies not in the power of its laws, but in the resilience of its people, even if they're holding a turnip. Story 3. The Icelandic cod locker dispute of 1874. In the sparse and wind-chapped village of Isafjörður, nestled in one of the deep fjords that cut through Iceland's northwest coast, life in the winter of 1874 was defined by fish and little else. The cod had always been central to survival. It fed families, filled trade ships, and soaked into the salt-stained fabric of daily life. But that year, as the snow piled high against the turf-roofed homes and men hauled their catch across frozen wharves, a new kind of tension brewed not with the sea, but with the Danish crown. For Iceland, still under Danish rule, the 19th century was a slow and careful negotiation between autonomy and submission. And while most disputes remained polite and bureaucratic, the matter of cod lockers, mundane wooden chests used to store dried or salted fish, became a symbol of something much larger. The trouble began, as such things often do, with a small administrative adjustment buried in a long document no one in the village had asked for. The Danish Ministry of Colonial Revenue in Copenhagen had issued Directive 43b, an addendum to fisheries policy. It required that all cod intended for trade be kept in standardized storage units, each registered, numbered, and subject to inspection. The purpose, officials explained, was to modernize the Icelandic fish export sector and ensure uniformity of volume and quality. The reality, however, was that this meant every fisherman would now need to purchase an approved cod locker built to Danish specifications, sealed with a government-issued iron clasp, and stamped with a tiny royal emblem shaped like a cod mid-leap. Each locker cost 3 rigsdaler, an exorbitant sum for men who often went without meat in the winter. And more insulting still, the law banned the use of traditional Icelandic storage chests, many of which had been handcrafted and passed down through generations. Some families had fished with the same storage box since before the Napoleonic Wars. To the Danish officials, it was a minor formality. To the Icelanders of Isafjörður, it was an intrusion not only into their economy, but into their heritage. The village's head fisherman, a stoic, silver-haired man named Thorvald Jorhafnsson, known simply as Valdi the Ledger, was the first to openly challenge the regulation. Named for his obsessive record-keeping, his ledgers were precise enough to record the weight of a salted cod to the half-ounce. Valdi believed in order, in rules, and in fairness. But even he bristled at what he called the meddling math of foreign men. At a winter gathering in the town's communal hall, lit by whale-oil lamps and muffled by fur-lined walls, Valdi stood and addressed a crowd of fishers and families. "Let them tax the air if they can fit it in a box, but we do not measure our living by locks and stamps. The cod are ours, so are the chests." The room, quiet at first, filled with the gentle thud of approval, fishermen tapping the butts of their wooden mugs on the floor in agreement. It was the beginning of what would become known, quietly and locally, as the cod locker dispute. Initially, the resistance was practical. Villagers simply ignored the regulation. They continued to use their traditional boxes, painting fake royal seals on the sides or carving their initials into the iron to confuse inspectors. A group of local woodworkers began crafting imitation cod lockers that looked authentic but didn't meet the required measurements. By early spring, word reached Reykjavik, where the Danish-appointed magistrate Jens Toftegard requested enforcement agents be dispatched to Isafjörður. 2 inspectors arrived in late March, wearing long coats, tall boots, and expressions of practiced boredom. They began their work quietly, inspecting docks and storage sheds, recording locker numbers, and issuing fines for non-compliant containers. One fisherman was fined for using a pre-directive container, which happened to be a wedding gift from his grandfather. The fine amounted to 2 weeks' earnings. The community response was calm but clever. Rather than open confrontation, they embraced a tactic borrowed from their own seas: misdirection. Each time the inspectors tried to log a cod locker, they were met with a baffling assortment of obstacles. Some lockers were filled with rocks instead of fish. Others were labeled in a mishmash of runes and Latin script. One bore a painted image of a Danish inspector chasing a cod, with the words, "Catch what you can't carry." And then there were the ledger doubles. Valdi, drawing on his reputation and record-keeping skills, orchestrated a coordinated effort to duplicate storage logs. Each fisherman kept two books, one for official inspection and one with the real numbers. Both were written meticulously in the same hand, with the same ink, and only subtle discrepancies in phrasing. To outsiders, the forgeries were indistinguishable. But the most elegant act of rebellion came in April, when the town staged an official locker exhibition. Ostensibly organized to celebrate cooperation with the Danish Fisheries Directive, it invited inspectors to review the town's collection of cod lockers. What they saw were pristine, regulation-sized boxes lined up in rows on the dock, stamped and sealed. What they didn't know was that every single one had been emptied beforehand, replaced with hollow replicas containing sand, wood shavings, or in one case, a note reading, "You may box the fish, but never the fisherman." Despite such antics, no arrests were made. The inspectors filed confused reports and requested further guidance from Reykjavik. Behind the scenes, however, tension was growing. The Danish ministry, increasingly embarrassed by the slow progress and public ridicule of the policy, doubled down. They issued a second directive requiring any unregistered cod to be destroyed on the spot. The implication was clear: resistance would now come with tangible loss. And so the stakes rose. The sea was unforgiving, the winter long, and the cod catch was the difference between hunger and survival. Valdi and the villagers now had to choose: risk confiscation and starvation, or submit to the regulations they had so far defied. And so we are left with an uncomfortable silence, waves crashing against icy hulls, wooden chests filled with risk, and the looming shadow of official punishment on the horizon. Would they yield to the crown? Or would the village of Isafjordur find a new way to outmaneuver the rule of boxes and seals? As the spring thaw crept slowly over the craggy ridges of the Westfjords, the villagers of Isafjordur found themselves at a grim crossroads. Their quiet rebellion against Directive 43B had persisted through wit and subtle sabotage. But the Danish response had grown colder, sharper, and like the sea, less forgiving. The new destruction clause, issued from Copenhagen without debate or consultation, changed the nature of the conflict. It permitted inspectors to confiscate and destroy any fish found in unregistered, non-regulation cod lockers. No appeals, no compensation. In a village that subsisted on salted cod, this was no longer a matter of ledgers or pride. It was about winter survival. In the weeks that followed, inspectors returned not two this time, but four. They were younger, sterner, and less amused than their predecessors. Accompanied by uniformed constables, they began their rounds without conversation. They carried hammers, hooks, and ledgers stamped with the royal seal. 3 lockers were broken, and their contents dumped directly into the sea. Each time the villagers stood silently and watched. There were no riots, no protests, but the silence was heavy, thick with restrained fury and sharpened by cold, salt air. That night the town hall filled to capacity. Fishermen, salt workers, coopers, and widows gathered around long, candle-lit tables, the walls layered in sheepskin and driftwood. Valdi the ledger stood once again, his thick ledger book under one arm. He opened to a page marked with a red ribbon and read aloud the exact weight of cod destroyed in the past week: 612 kilos, or nearly 2 weeks' worth of trade for the entire village. Then he closed the book and without flourish said, "We now count what we do not declare." It was the beginning of what the villagers would later call the hidden harvest. From that point forward, Isafjordur operated in 2 layers. The surface, where Danish inspectors saw spotless, regulation-sized lockers, and the true operation carried out below decks, in sea caves under floorboards, and even buried in salt pits beneath tool sheds. The ingenuity was stunning. Old-fashioned cod lockers were buried just beneath the ice-lined floors of boathouses, with trapdoors disguised by crates of iron nails or empty sacks of wool. Fishermen swapped out real catches with hollowed-out dummies filled with sand when they saw inspection boats approaching. Children were taught to speak in code, referring to cod as feathers and to lockers as boots. And all the while, the official ledgers continued to reflect quiet compliance. One of the boldest strategies involved the creation of double-bottom barrels, coopered by a mute craftsman named Gisli the Round, who communicated only through gestures and charcoal sketches. His barrels could be filled with salt and legally declared as preserving goods, while concealing an inner core lined with tightly packed fillets. These barrels were shipped to Reykjavik under proper documentation. Inspectors, growing used to their appearance, never bothered to dig too deep. It was Gisli, too, who devised the seal swap. Using discarded cod locker emblems, he carved near-perfect duplicates out of whalebone and affixed them to traditional chests. These passed casual inspection and were eventually smuggled into other villages, spreading the resistance further. By midsummer, it became clear that the Crown's crackdown had paradoxically fueled a far more sophisticated black market operation, one that now extended along the fjords and reached as far as Akureyri. In Reykjavik, Magistrate Jens Toftegard began to feel the pressure. His monthly reports to Copenhagen had grown increasingly vague. Enforcement costs were rising, compliance rates stagnating, and word had begun to reach foreign traders that Iceland's fish trade was increasingly unreliable. And then came the ledger leak. A package, carefully wrapped in dried seaweed and sealed with wax, was delivered anonymously to the governor's office in Reykjavik. Inside was a handwritten ledger written in Valdi's distinctive script, detailing the weight of unregistered cod harvested, stored, and sold throughout the past 3 months. At the bottom, in neat but firm script, read the final line: "We do not deny your law, we merely prove it cannot hold water." No names were included, no dates, but the implication was unmistakable. The resistance was organized, it was intentional, and it was winning. The leak became a quiet scandal in Danish circles. Some called for increased enforcement. Others, more practical, suggested repealing the locker regulation altogether, citing the expense, embarrassment, and perhaps most importantly the loss of trade trust. But in Ísafjörður, life continued, balanced carefully between compliance and deception. That balance was finally broken in September, when an overzealous inspector, attempting to break into a suspected illegal storage site, mistakenly destroyed a burial vault used during a recent flu outbreak. Though no one was harmed, the public outrage was immediate. Local elders, invoking ancient Icelandic burial protections, filed a formal complaint to both the Crown and the Lutheran bishopric. The complaint was picked up by the Danish press, which, sensing a scandal, published editorials questioning why bureaucrats were busting open graves over barrels of fish. Public relations collapsed. Foreign buyers, including several from Scotland and Prussia, began pressuring the Danish government to resolve the situation and stabilize cod exports. The Icelandic commercial class, previously silent, now sided with the fishermen. In December 1874, almost exactly 1 year after Directive 43b was issued, a royal decree was signed in Copenhagen. The cod locker regulation was rescinded. Storage standards would now be managed locally, and traditional cod chests were once again considered legal. But the Crown, in keeping with its bureaucratic sensibilities, refused to acknowledge the dispute. The repeal was framed as a simplification in light of evolving commercial patterns. No apology, no recognition. In Ísafjörður, they didn't care. When word arrived via the post ship, Valdi didn't speak. He simply walked to his ledger, drew a line across the page, and wrote, "We have weighed and we have endured. The seal breaks, the fish remains." But the question lingered, shared quietly in boatyards and fish sheds. If something as small as a box could inspire a year-long resistance, What else might the villages of Iceland resist slowly, quietly, and completely? Winter in Isafjörður does not announce itself with ceremony. It creeps in, quiet and firm, blanketing the fjord with snow while the sea darkens and the air stiffens with salt. It was into this familiar cold, in the final weeks of 1874, that the villagers received official word. Directive 43B was no more. The cod locker regulation imposed from abroad, enforced through ledgers and seals, had been repealed. There was no fanfare, no royal carriage bearing proclamation, just a folded piece of parchment delivered by a coastal post officer, damp with spray and hastily translated from Danish to Icelandic by the town schoolteacher. But its contents were clear. Local storage standards were to be respected. The iron-sealed, government-issued cod lockers were no longer required. For a people who had never sought glory, only autonomy, this was more than a victory. It was a restoration. At the town hall that night, Valdi the ledger stood again, though this time not to speak of regulations or fish weights, but to read aloud the final entry of his personal cod ledger, a book that had, over the course of the dispute, come to symbolize resistance by means of meticulous honesty. The weight of the sea cannot be measured by the state. The value of tradition is not known by men who write laws from cities they've never left. We have not hidden from the crown, we have endured it. He closed the book, tied it shut with twine, and handed it to the village's carpenter, who placed it in a sealed drawer within the town's archives. It was never opened again in his lifetime. The quiet restoration. In the weeks that followed, the wooden cod lockers reappeared, some newly made, others retrieved from underground cellars and dusty attics. Old carved symbols of fishing families' anchors, waves, birds, runes were re-inked, fresh paint applied. For the first time in a year, cod was salted and stored in public view without fear of confiscation. Children played by the docks without being shushed. Fishermen mended their nets in open daylight. Even the church bell, which had been silent through much of the dispute, rang freely again, 3 short chimes at dawn, a long one at dusk, as it had for generations. And though the inspectors were recalled and the regulations repealed, the lessons of the cod locker dispute remained etched in memory. That bureaucracy, without understanding, breeds resistance. That even small communities, if united, can outlast the machinery of empire. That resistance need not be violent to be effective. It wasn't just that the villagers had rejected a policy. It was that they had rewritten the unwritten rules, demonstrating how misapplied regulation could be quietly, methodically unraveled through solidarity and adaptation. Echoes and endings. Word of the Icelandic resistance spread, in limited ways, across the northern world. In Norway and the Faroe Islands, fishers told stories of the village that outweighed the seal. In Copenhagen, the debacle was referred to behind closed doors as the fish embarrassment, and it would be several years before any new regulations were attempted in the colonies. But for Isafjörður, the true legacy was not political, it was personal. Children who had grown up during the dispute now understood the weight of a ledger, the meaning of a box, the importance of knowing when to comply and when to remain still and wait the tide. Valdi retired from fishing the following spring. He lived quietly in a turf-roofed home just above the harbor where he grew potatoes and reared hens. Occasionally, he was seen at the market, inspecting the cod chests not for compliance, but for craftsmanship. When he passed in 1881, he was buried with a small wooden box carved by Gisli the Round. It contained nothing but a slip of paper, inscribed with the phrase, "Let them seal the box, we'll salt the truth." That box, along with his sealed ledger, remains in the Isafjörður Heritage Archives to this day. No tourist signs point to it. No plaques commemorate the cod locker dispute. But in the way the villagers store their fish, record their weights, and pass their traditions to the next generation, you can still feel it. A dispute with no weapons, no speeches, no martyrs, just boxes, salt, silence, and one open-ended truth. How many other small laws, passed without notice, reshape the world of those who must quietly bear them? Story 4. The Stolen Postage Stamp Conspiracy of Philadelphia. In 1876, Philadelphia stood proudly at the center of the American Centennial Exhibition, a sprawling celebration of the nation's industrial prowess, constitutional heritage, and bold march toward modernity. Amid the fanfare of steam engines, glass pavilions, and mechanical marvels, a quieter machinery continued turning inside the marble walls of the Philadelphia Post Office, building a squat and serious structure on Chestnut Street, just a few blocks from Independence Hall. There, among brass mail slots and endless stacks of brown paper parcels, a curious pattern began to emerge. At first, it was a mere whisper in the clerk's quarters, a ledger that didn't quite add up, a postal route with unusually high stamp usage, a clerk who always seemed to be working late but leaving early. These were not matters that inspired alarm. Philadelphia's postal bureaucracy was, if nothing else, comfortably sluggish. But to one man, these small inconsistencies rang louder than any Liberty Bell. Mr. Alvin G. Merrow, assistant postal accountant third class, was a meticulous man, described by coworkers as quiet to a fault and faultless in detail. Merrow was known for his love of cross-referencing and his aggressive underlining habits. His office was filled with ledgers, nib pens, and an immaculately maintained drawer of canceled stamps organized by region, date, and cancellation angle. It was from this temple of dull efficiency that Merrow began what would become known, though never officially acknowledged, as the stolen postage stamp conspiracy. The discovery. Merrow's discovery began with a single envelope, returned undelivered from Lancaster County. The stamp had been properly affixed and canceled, but the cancellation mark struck him as wrong-tilted, overly clean, too sharp for a stamp allegedly processed in the outer counties, where ink pads were known to be drier and clerks less careful. He cross-referenced the stamp with others from the same region and found discrepancies in cancellation angle consistency, a detail only Merrow would care to notice. This led him to a stack of similar envelopes, and slowly, a pattern emerged. A significant number of postage stamps were being fraudulently reused, carefully lifted from original envelopes, and reapplied with counterfeit cancellation, marks likely using a rubber stamp of unknown origin. In theory, this was a minor offense. Stamp reuse had been a petty issue since postage first required payment, but the volume suggested something bigger. Merrow calculated that over 6,000 reused stamps had passed through Philadelphia's central office in just 3 months, a potential loss of nearly $60, an alarming sum in the world of 1-cent stamps. Worse still, the stamps all followed a narrow corridor, routed through just 5 postal stations, all within the jurisdiction of Zone 12, a sleepy, mixed-income district just west of Broad Street. Merrow, constrained by his minor rank, could not issue investigations or confront supervisors. Instead, he did what he did best: he compiled. He built an index of suspicious stamps, mapped their postal origins, tracked which clerks had logged each parcel, and constructed an internal stamp flow chart, which he rolled out across his floor like a general planning a siege. By the end of the month, he had constructed what he believed to be a fully operational stamp laundering network, routed through postal workers, neighborhood fixers, and a storefront that purported to sell stationery and tobacco, but whose ledgers showed more postage stamps than cigars. The method. The fraud was simple but effective. Used stamps, especially those from high-volume mail like utility bills or catalog requests, were carefully steamed off envelopes and resold in small batches to cooperating postal clerks. These clerks would either resell them under the table or affix them to outgoing mail in place of official stock. Some stamps were cleaned, using lemon juice to dissolve cancellation ink, then recanceled using a counterfeit rubber hand stamp, possibly carved from shoe leather or repurposed from obsolete postal equipment. The clean stamps were indistinguishable at a glance and passed smoothly through the system. But Merrow's findings suggested something even more audacious: a centralized operation, not a loose collection of petty cheats. He identified at least 3 postmen who had never filed sick leave, but were nonetheless frequently off their route. He noted parcels routed through unusual hands. Most intriguingly, he discovered a sudden uptick in stamped mail from local businesses known to be struggling, suggesting they were purchasing cheap, second-hand postage to stay afloat. In effect, someone had created a black market for the most boring object imaginable: the postage stamp. And Philadelphia, the very cradle of American governance, was unknowingly allowing this rebellion of glue and ink to spread through its veins. A quiet battle begins. Unsure of what to do, Merrow wrote an anonymous letter to the regional postal inspector's office in Washington. In it, he outlined his findings and enclosed copies of his cancellation charts, his ledger flow maps, and 5 examples of forged stamps with penciled annotations. He expected a swift response. He received nothing. Weeks passed, then months. By now, Merrow's colleagues noticed that he spent most of his lunch hour staring at the wall. Some joked that he'd developed a romance with the postage scale. Only his close friend, Miss Lillian Hofer, a records clerk, suspected something more serious. It wasn't until she discovered him red-inking old envelopes after hours, muttering, "The angles are wrong, they're always wrong," that she intervened. Together, they reviewed his data. She confirmed what he already knew: this wasn't petty fraud. It was a deliberate system, operating quietly, economically, and under the watch of blind bureaucracy. But still, there was silence from Washington. The stamps kept moving, the losses mounted, the counterfeit cancellations became more refined. And the question lingered like the glue on the back of a reused 1-cent stamp. If the federal government wouldn't act, who would stop a conspiracy held together by nothing but paper, ink, and careful silence? By the autumn of 1876, the American Centennial Exhibition was winding down. While brass bands played beneath bunting and tourists posed beside replica Liberty Bells, something quieter, more delicate, and far less celebrated continued to unfold beneath the bureaucratic surface of Philadelphia. The stamp conspiracy, as it would later be called by a few obscure civil service memos, remained unknown to the public. But inside the halls of the Chestnut Street Post Office, Alvin G. Merrow and Miss Lillian Hofer were very much aware that time was running out. The evidence was piling higher. Each day brought new envelopes, fresh specimens of stamps with suspect cancellations tilted by degrees, inked in colors not officially sanctioned, placed with slightly unusual spacing. Merrow's personal catalog now spanned 3 ledgers, with envelope samples tucked neatly between wax paper sheets and indexed by type, cancellation device, and known postal route. Yet despite the elegance of the data, the federal silence continued. Merrow's anonymous report to the Washington Postal Inspector's Office had gone unanswered. The machinery of accountability, ever slow and overburdened, had failed to turn. So the 2 clerks decided to act. The quiet investigation expands. Rather than raise suspicion among their supervisors, many of whom Merrow suspected might be willfully ignorant, they expanded their operation in secret. Lillian, who had access to delivery manifests and route logs, began cross-checking addresses. She noticed that certain parcels, particularly bulk mail from 5 small businesses, always passed through Route 14 or Route 17, regardless of their origin. These routes were both serviced by the same postal supervisor, Mr. Ezra Coombs, a stout man with a large mustache, a fondness for licorice, and a spotless official record. Merrow, too, had noticed Coombs' name appearing often in the shift logs for unusual deliveries. He also found it suspicious that Coombs had been assigned supervisory duties over the lost letter desk, a location that conveniently handled parcels with illegible addresses, misaligned stamps, or irregular packaging. To test their theory, Lillian and Marrow conducted a simple experiment. They mailed 5 identical letters from different parts of the city, each bearing a slightly off-center, poorly canceled stamp from Marrow's known, compromised batch. Each letter was addressed to a fictitious business, each placed on a different postal route except one, which was routed via Route 17 under Coombs' purview. 4 letters were returned for insufficient postage. The 5th was delivered without issue. They had their man. Unpacking the conspiracy. As the pieces came together, a clearer picture emerged. The fraud was far more systemic than Marrow had imagined. Clerks at neighborhood post offices had been quietly reselling canceled stamps to local merchants. These stamps were cleaned, chemically treated, and recanceled using unofficial rubber hand stamps, likely stored off-site. Several small but legitimate businesses, facing financial pressure, had opted into the scheme in exchange for discounted postage. At least 2 postal carriers on routes 14 and 17 were complicit, ensuring that suspect mail was passed through with no scrutiny. But most fascinating was the role of Coombs. He didn't just participate, he coordinated. His office, though cluttered with bundles of mail and smell of stale licorice, had become a hub of operations. It was here that batches of washed stamps were reissued, new hand stamps were crafted, and ledger entries were adjusted. He operated with the confidence of a man who understood something fundamental about bureaucracy. It often prefers ignorance to embarrassment. And he may have been right. Marrow and Lillian discussed their next move for days. Turning over their findings to internal leadership risked having the matter buried or worse, having their own roles questioned. But then something unexpected happened. The whisper in Washington. On October 17th, a letter arrived from Marrow not addressed to him formally, but simply marked attention, stamp record clerk. Inside was a single slip of paper bearing a typed sentence. "We have seen your ledgers, proceed discreetly. Trust no local channels. Continue documentation." It was unsigned, but it came from Washington. Lillian recognized the envelope type as one used by the Special Postal Investigation Division, a little-known office created after the Civil War to monitor fraud in federal services. They had no public address, no listed officials. Their existence was mostly myth among lower clerks. Now they were watching, and it changed everything. The final ledger. Under careful observation and quiet confidence, Marrow and Lillian deepened their investigation. With informal backing from Washington, they began collecting sworn statements disguised as customer feedback surveys from merchants suspected of using discounted stamps. They observed Coombs more closely, tracking his movements, his evening habits, his odd tendency to visit the same tobacco shop 3 times a week but never leave with tobacco. That shop, they confirmed, was where the counterfeit cancellation devices were stored. By late November, the conspiracy had become so clear it could be diagrammed, which Marrow, of course, did. Using string, pins, and a large corkboard borrowed from the supply closet, he created a sprawling map of corruption that stretched from neighborhood mailrooms to licensed businesses to a central desk in Coombs' office. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. And then came the knock at the door. 2 plain-clothed men, one tall and one wearing a bowler hat, stepped into the Philadelphia post office just after 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. They said nothing. They walked straight to the supervisor's wing. Within 10 minutes, Ezra Coombs was escorted out the back, eyes down, hands in his pockets. No charges were ever formally filed. No explanation given to the staff. But from that day forward, the irregular stamps disappeared. The strange cancellation angles vanished, and Postal Route 17 received a new carrier, one who walked the full path, rain or shine, with no interruptions. Marrow and Lillian never spoke of the incident publicly. The thank you from Washington was never sent, but they understood. The system had corrected itself in the only way it knew how, quietly. Still, Marrow couldn't help but wonder. If a conspiracy built on nothing but glue and ink could reach so far, what other things pass unnoticed beneath the weight of a postage stamp? When the snows of early 1877 dusted the rooftops of Philadelphia and the centennial celebrations faded into distant memory, the Postal Service returned to its usual rhythm. Parcels thudding into bins, clerks stamping envelopes, and bundles of mail tied neatly with string. The great machinery of civic correspondence turned on. Yet within this seemingly ordinary operation, a quiet transformation had occurred. The stolen postage stamp conspiracy, once humming beneath the bureaucratic surface, had vanished dismantled piece by piece through quiet diligence, obsessive documentation, and the refusal to look away from small things. But for Alvin G. Marrow, the victory felt incomplete. There had been no trials, no headlines, no names named. Ezra Coombs had simply disappeared from the system, reassigned Marrow suspected to a quiet office somewhere west, far from stamps, ledgers, and licorice. The businesses that had purchased reused postage saw no fines. The clerks complicit in the scheme were quietly rotated to other posts. Even the counterfeit cancellation device's 5 rubber stamps with hand-carved postal rings were never publicly accounted for. Officially, it never happened. A system that cannot afford scandal. Marrow had always understood the logic of bureaucracy. Systems resist disruption not through action, but through inaction by simply choosing not to acknowledge the rot in their beams. But what this experience had revealed was something more complex, a deliberate calculus within the postal hierarchy, that the cost of a scandal often outweighs the price of fraud. In a world where even theft was measured in fractions of pennies, dignity, not justice, was the currency most fiercely protected. Washington's anonymous support, cryptic and fleeting as it was, had confirmed that Marrow's suspicions weren't paranoia. But even the Special Postal Investigation Division hadn't wanted a paper trail. Their silence was strategic, their message clear. Document everything, speak of nothing. So Marrow did what he always did, he wrote. In the months that followed, he quietly compiled his final report, a thick, gray-bound ledger titled Postal Irregularities and Observed Anomalies in Stamp Handling, 1875-77. It included 14 case studies of forged cancellation, 83 examples of washed stamps, 6 unofficial supply chain paths, a hand-drawn map of affected postal routes, a complete cancellation typology, organized by angle and ink consistency. He printed one copy. He signed it only with his initials. Then he placed it in a sealed envelope and mailed it, of course, using a perfectly canceled, fully compliant 1-cent stamp. It was addressed simply to Records Office, Department of Postal Integrity, Washington. If such a department existed at all. Lillian Hofer and the Archive of the Overlooked. As for Lillian Hofer, she returned to her record-keeping work with a quiet pride. She began collecting oddities from her years in the service: misprinted stamps, failed perforations, envelopes with accidental poetry formed by misaligned address stamps. She called it the Archive of the Overlooked. In it, she placed a small note. These things are not important because of what they are. They are important because someone tried to ignore them. Her archive would remain unseen for decades, stored in a banker's box beneath a library shelf, until it was discovered by accident in 1929 by a clerk looking for ink refills. By then, both Lillian and Marrow had passed quietly from memory. The legacy of the invisible. The story of the stamp conspiracy was never told publicly. There were no reforms, no famous names, no acknowledgments of Marrow's work, but something changed nonetheless. Within a year, the Postal Service issued new cancellation protocols, replacing hand stamps with standardized metal rolling machines that left cleaner, harder-to-fake impressions. A new internal review system was quietly implemented, requiring random audit samples of bulk postage users. It became standard across all urban post offices to rotate clerks quarterly. There were no public announcements, but the effect was lasting. And it all began with a man no one noticed, who stared too long at a cancellation angle on a 1-cent envelope. Marrow's story in the end wasn't one of scandal but of vigilance, of two clerks who believed that integrity lived not in proclamations but in patterns, in angles, in the glue beneath a reused stamp. And the quiet thought remains: how many systems today still turn on stolen stamps in silence? And how many people like Marrow and Lillian are quietly watching? Story 5. The Quiet Mutiny on the HMS Donegal. In the spring of 1810, during the height of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Royal Navy maintained its vast network of ships across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the icy seas of the North. Battles were being fought, convoys protected, and trade routes watched. The press wrote of victories and blockades. But nowhere in the official dispatches would one find mention of HMS Donegal, a 20-gun sloop of war assigned to what the Admiralty described as low-urgency coastal observation. Her orders were clear: patrol the foggy channels between the Faroe Islands and the Shetlands, monitor weather conditions, report vessel movements, and maintain position. In truth, the Donegal was a vessel assigned to do nothing officially. Originally launched in 1805 and never once engaged in combat, the Gull was an unremarkable ship of plain timbers and sluggish lines, lightly armed and poorly provisioned. Her crew, 80 men and 3 officers, had been assembled hastily from volunteers and conscripts deemed unfit for frontline duty. Some were deaf in one ear, others had bad knees, or a mild case of mutinous attitude that hadn't yet warranted a flogging. The ship's captain, Lieutenant Jonathan Dorrell, was a middling officer with excellent handwriting and no ambition. He was known among colleagues as the man who could write 5 pages without saying anything. A safe appointment, fit to command a ship meant to be forgotten. The real trouble began not with battle or storm, but with the daily biscuit ration. The issue of the biscuit. Naval biscuit, also known as hardtack, was the cornerstone of every sailor's diet. Hard as wood, riddled with weevils and baked to last longer than the ships themselves, these biscuits were issued by weight, not appetite. But on the Donegal, a quiet error in provisioning never formally recorded meant the crew was issued biscuit stock, intended for dry storage in a Plymouth warehouse, not sea duty. The result: rations that were stale to the point of inedibility within 2 weeks of departure. The crew tried soaking them, pounding them into porridge, even disguising them with the occasional spoonful of salted molasses. Nothing worked. Men began refusing their rations and bartering below deck with dried apples and pipe tobacco instead. When the boatswain, a man known only as Pottle, raised the issue to Lieutenant Dorrell, the captain replied in his typically formal tone: "It is not the function of command to assess biscuit softness. Our duty is to maintain schedule and submit weekly weather observations. That is all." So the men persisted, but the days grew long, the wind stagnant and the sea empty. No enemy vessels appeared, no trade ships passed. The logbook became a parade of sameness. Moderate swells, northwest wind, no sightings. Heavy fog, rations distributed, crew steady. The sameness began to wear down the crew's patience. It wasn't mutiny, exactly, there was no violence, no threats, but something odd began to happen. The crew simply stopped responding to orders. The non-mutiny begins. It started with the watch bells. One morning, the bell to signal a change in watch was rung by the quartermaster twice, and no one moved. The next day, the helmsman left his post mid-shift, walked below deck and sat quietly in the mess, staring at his hands. Pottle, when questioned, shrugged and said, "He steered yesterday, thought he might like a break." Soon, tasks like swabbing the deck or raising the signal flags were left undone. Dorrell, true to form, documented it all in the daily log but issued no punishment. Crew appear sluggish, possibly low morale, provisions stable, will observe. By the third week, the ship was operating at a bare minimum. The sails were reefed but rarely adjusted. Observational notes were scribbled hastily and repeated across entries. The ship drifted further off its charted course, but no one corrected it. The officers, including a disinterested master's mate named Tompkins, appeared equally disengaged. They remained in their cabins, emerging for meals and brief inspections, then retreating with books and letters from home. Tompkins was known to recite poetry aloud to himself for hours. The atmosphere on board was not rebellious. It was calm, disconnected, as if the entire crew had collectively decided that continuing to obey orders was optional. No argument, no declaration, just a slow, collective disengagement from duty. Dorrell, still logging daily entries, began writing longer reflections. His official reports to the Admiralty were sent late and often contained philosophical musings. The crew, though hale and unthreatened, appears to have entered a state of maritime torpor. One might argue that the absence of conflict or adversity has rendered discipline abstract. He concluded one letter with a question. Can a ship drift into disobedience without changing course? Back in Portsmouth, no one paid attention. The dozing gull had never been expected to accomplish anything notable. Her reports were archived unread, her mailboat deliveries skimmed and stored. The bureaucracy, like the sea, had absorbed her without friction. But within the drifting hull, the crew now functioned in a self-organized rhythm. Watches were observed sporadically. Food was prepared communally by whoever felt inclined. A card game known as Dead Wind was played for hours below deck. The sails were trimmed only when weather demanded it. And all the while, Lieutenant Dorrell continued to document the non-events of the voyage. He seemed oddly accepting of the situation, perhaps even relieved that no discipline was required of him. When the purser failed to issue rum rations one evening, no one complained. The following night the same occurred. A week later, the rum was still untouched in its barrels. The men had simply stopped caring. Was it a mutiny? No red flags were raised. No officers were locked in their cabins. No articles of rebellion declared. But obedience, like the wind, had gone still. And yet the dozing gull remained afloat, sailing silent. Unruled, yet not rudderless. And so the question lingered, logged faithfully in Dorrell's journal. If discipline fails without disruption, is it truly gone or simply asleep? The HMS Dozing Gull drifted further north than intended, caught not in a storm but in a fog of quiet neglect. By the second month of the patrol, the ship's crew, though physically healthy and provisioned, had ceased to function as a hierarchical naval unit. There were no punishments, no commands shouted, no defiant speeches, just silence. In most maritime mutinies, the rupture is loud and sudden, a denial of orders, a taking of arms, a seizing of power. But aboard the Dozing Gull, what unfolded was something else entirely. A maritime entropy, the slow unraveling of duty under the weight of monotony and irrelevance. Lieutenant Jonathan Dorrell, who still technically commanded the vessel, made no effort to reassert discipline. In his meticulously penned log, he continued to note the ship's drift, the weather, and the crew's gradual disengagement with naval protocol. But even his entries began to take on a tone less of command and more of detached philosophical observation. Deck swabbing has ceased. The men appear neither sullen nor defiant. Rather, they behave as if aboard a different sort of vessel, one where function is secondary to presence. The crew becomes a community. By mid-June, The lines between rank and role had eroded completely. Sailors began sleeping where they liked. Hammocks were shared or abandoned in favor of makeshift bunks on deck, under the partial shelter of unused sailcloths. Pottle, the boatswain, who once enforced order with a practiced bark, now spent most of his days fishing over the side and carving elaborate scenes into biscuit planks. He gave informal lessons on rope tying to whomever was interested, though he insisted he no longer represented authority in any traditional sense. The cook, a portly man named Raskin, started letting crew members experiment with the galley. Dried beans were rehydrated in tea. Hardtack was baked a second time in hopes of making it more palatable. One man attempted to ferment lemon rinds in seawater, producing a substance that was neither wine nor vinegar, but was cheerfully shared during mealtimes. The sails were only trimmed when winds shifted dramatically. The helm was unmanned for long stretches. Still, the ship floated on, caught in the lazy spin of northern currents and graced with unusually forgiving weather. The officers, too, adapted. Lieutenant Dorrell spent most mornings on the quarterdeck, reading Pliny's natural history and occasionally sketching seagulls. Master's mate Tompkins composed verses, none particularly good, and read them aloud to uninterested seamen with benign satisfaction. There was no resistance because there was nothing to resist. No punishments, no urgency, no expectations. The Gull had become a floating monastery of maritime inertia. A brief return to reality. It wasn't until a signal ship, a cutter from HMS Calabash, appeared on the horizon in early July that any sense of naval protocol returned. The Calabash, a patrol vessel tasked with collecting mail and checking on isolated ships, hailed the dozing Gull with flags. The crew scrambled not with panic but with mild embarrassment. Hammocks were stuffed into lockers. Uniforms, dusty from disuse, were hastily brushed and buttoned. The deck was swabbed for the first time in 3 weeks. Dorrell, summoned to the gangway, received a young lieutenant from the Calabash who brought news. Naval logistics were shifting. The dozing Gull was to be recalled to Portsmouth for resupply and potential reassignment. The visitor stayed no longer than 20 minutes. He asked no questions, took no notes, seemed unaware or unwilling to notice the strange stillness of the crew. To him, the ship appeared old, neglected, but seaworthy. That was enough. As the cutter disappeared over the horizon, the crew stood in silence. Then Pottle muttered, "Well, there's that then," and returned to his fishing line. The return. The journey south took just under a month. During that time, the ship functioned in a strange equilibrium, not under command, but under agreement. Helmsmen rotated voluntarily. Meals were prepared communally. Logs were written, not out of requirement but habit. And when the ship sighted the Hampshire coast, the men gathered on deck not in ranks but shoulder to shoulder. No orders were given to anchor. They simply did so. At Portsmouth Dockyard, the dockmaster, perplexed by the ship's unannounced arrival, asked for Lieutenant Dorrell's logs. Dorrell handed over 4 volumes. Only the last entry stood out. "We have returned. The ship is intact. The crew is quiet. We await instruction if any be forthcoming." The dock officials conducted no inquiry. There had been no formal complaint. No dereliction of duty had been officially reported. The dozing Gull had completed her patrol route, albeit slowly and strangely. The Admiralty filed the return as routine reassignment and placed the crew on shore leave. No punishments, no commendations, just silence. And thus the dozing Gull, after drifting for nearly 6 months under the weight of its own irrelevance, had returned safely home without a single command followed, yet without a single law technically broken. The last note. Weeks later, a junior clerk sorting records in the Admiralty's basement discovered a note tucked into one of Dorrell's ledgers. It was unsigned but written in his unmistakable hand. A ship need not mutiny with muskets. It can slip free in silence like a rope left untied. The note was filed away, unremarked. The dazing gull was later decommissioned and sold for parts. Its crew, mostly disbanded and reassigned, rarely spoke of their time aboard. Some called it the holiday patrol, others, that quiet voyage, but none claimed it was a mutiny, and perhaps it was. Perhaps it was simply what happens when duty meets stillness, and command forgets to matter. Story 6. The Biscuit Ration Ledger of the Boer War. In 1901, as the Second Boer War dragged into its third year, British field commanders spoke less of victory and more of administrative endurance. The war had evolved into a conflict not of pitched battles, but of logistics, blockades, and attrition. Across the sun-scorched veldt of the South African interior, British troops built endless lines of blockhouses, maintained sprawling supply depots, and engaged in slow, cautious marches from nowhere to somewhere and back again. Amid this theater of tedium, there was a single, constant source of anxiety and dispute: rations. Men needed to eat, but what they ate, when, how, and in what quantity was a matter managed not by cooks or sergeants, but by ledgers. And in one particularly dusty supply post just west of Bloemfontein, an unassuming army quartermaster named Second Clerk Hubert Snelling found himself at the center of a dispute that would become known, though only in footnotes and filing cabinets, as the Biscuit Ledger Affair. The setting: Depot 19B. Depot 19B was not a glamorous post. Nestled between two low hills and surrounded by barbed wire, it served as a waypoint for supply trains and convoys moving between British-held territory and recently pacified zones. Its population fluctuated between 150 and 300 men, depending on who was marching where and which rail lines were still intact. Snelling, who had served in Egypt as a grain scribe, had been transferred to 19B on account of his neat penmanship and consistent accuracy in biscuit tabulation. He was thin, pale, and known for carrying a ledger even to the latrine. His job was simple in theory: issue biscuits according to Army ration regulations, exactly 12 ounces per man per day. The biscuits, sometimes referred to as field bread, though neither term was accurate, were hard, dense, and designed less for enjoyment than for caloric consistency. Manufactured in British factories and shipped across oceans, they arrived in crates marked with stenciled codes, such as BKT STD 900, denoting type, standard, and production date. They were stored in canvas tents with little ventilation. As weeks passed, humidity and rodents took their toll. Still, the ration regulations never changed. Snelling's ledgers were kept to exacting standards. Each entry recorded the number of men, time of day, crate code, biscuit weight issued, spoilage percentage, if any, and the initials of the distribution corporal. His ledgers never showed an inconsistency. And that was precisely the problem. The discrepancy. In June 1901, an infantry captain named Arthur Henley arrived at 19B with a column of 137 men, sweaty, exhausted, and hungry after a month of chasing elusive Boer fighters across the plains. Henley was a meticulous officer, fond of regulation and order, and proud of having published an essay titled "On the Utility of Biscuit-Based Morale in Protracted Engagements." On his second day at the depot, Henley submitted a formal complaint. "The men under my command are receiving insufficient daily biscuit weight. Their rations, weighed with my own scale, fall between 10.3 and 10.7 ounces, not the standard 12. Snelling, affronted, responded with precision. "The ledger reflects 12 ounces distributed per man, per day, as per Army Order 412B. The crate labels confirm the issuance. Any deficit may be due to improper handling post-distribution." Henley insisted on a joint weighing. A crate was opened, biscuits weighed, and the findings were inconclusive. Some biscuits were indeed lighter than expected, others heavier. The average fell around 11.2 ounces. Not ideal but close enough, said Snelling. Henley disagreed. A formal inquiry was requested. The ledger and the loophole. A week later, a logistics inspector arrived from Pretoria. His name was Mr. Mallison, and he had the look of a man who took no pleasure in war, only in columns properly balanced. Mallison reviewed Snelling's ledgers for 3 days. He found no falsification, no omissions, and no math errors. But he did notice something odd. The biscuit codes being issued were all older stock crates marked 900 and 1000, despite newer supplies being stored just yards away. Snelling explained, without hesitation, that biscuit crates were distributed by code order, oldest first, as per spoilage minimization guidelines outlined in General Provisioning Memo No. 74. Mallison agreed that was proper form. However, when one of the older crates was opened and weighed, every biscuit came in at around 10 ounces. The newer crates, closer to 12. It was then that Mallison discovered a buried addendum in a shipment record from London. A batch of biscuits had been manufactured under a temporary weight adjustment due to flour shortages. These were to be used only in emergency field rations, and their weight deficiency was to be noted and compensated with additional ration items where possible. This had never been communicated to Depot 19B. Snelling had issued the biscuits exactly as written in his ledger based on label, not weight. The ledgers were perfect. The rations were not. And therein lay the problem. What is accuracy? The inquiry reached a strange impasse. No one had violated policy. No fraud had occurred. And yet, the men had been underfed by as much as 15% for several weeks. Snelling refused to amend the ledgers retroactively, stating, "The books reflect what was taken from storage, not the hypothetical intentions of the biscuit. I cannot weigh a regulation." Henley, for his part, demanded the men be compensated retroactively with sweetened condensed milk or tinned beef. Mallison issued a final report that included a line that would become quietly famous among Army scribes. It is possible to be entirely accurate and entirely incorrect at the same time. In the end, the compromise was characteristically British. A new column was added to the ration ledger, expected biscuit weight versus measured. Clerks were instructed to begin spot-checking weights and adjusting supplementary rations accordingly. No one was blamed, no one was punished, no apology issued. But in the quiet offices of Pretoria, a copy of Snelling's ledger was filed into the MISC, Logistics South Africa Cabinet, under a folder titled Biscuit Ration Ledger, Inconclusive but Noteworthy. The quiet scandal at Depot 19B had left its mark not in headlines, nor in court-martials, but in the ledgers themselves. With the introduction of a new column, expected biscuit weight versus measured, a strange thing began to happen. Clerks started caring about numbers in a new way. For decades, the ration system of the British Army had been a creature of habit, not precision. It functioned on bulk estimations, standardized crates, and a general assumption that if the men weren't starving or rioting, the system worked. But now, the very idea that a biscuit might be both properly issued and insufficient had disturbed the comfortable haze of routine. And for Quartermaster Hubert Snelling, it became a personal crusade. Snelling's campaign. Shortly after the inquiry, Snelling petitioned Pretoria for a weighing scale accurate to half an ounce, a rare request for a field depot, where even water was rationed. To his surprise, the scale arrived in mid-July with a polite note. In support of improved ledger fidelity, per recommendation from Inspector Mallison. With new authority and cautious pride, Snelling began reweighing every crate of biscuit prior to distribution. He recorded not just what was issued, but how it deviated. Crates labeled 12 Oz routinely produced biscuits weighing 10.8 or 11.2 ounces, Only a few batches from newer supplies met the full mark. He wrote weekly reports, he drew charts, he developed a simple shorthand. LW equals lightweight. NW equals near weight. FW equals full weight. Soon, Snelling's personal ledger included bar graphs drawn in pencil, showing shifts in biscuit mass by month of manufacture. He began cross-referencing suppliers, noting that the Liverpool batches were consistently lighter than those from Portsmouth, and speculated about differences in flour composition or baking method. What had begun as a petty dispute was becoming a proto-nutritional audit of Army food conducted not by medical officers or generals, but by a lone clerk surrounded by crates and flies. Reaction from the field. Meanwhile, word of the affair had spread through unofficial channels. In the mobile units scattered across the veldt, soldiers began referring to their meals in Snelling units. "I got a full Snelling today," one man might say, hoisting a biscuit with real heft. "Half a Snelling and no jam," another would grumble, examining a brittle disc crumbling before his eyes. Snelling's name, never spoken with hatred, became a sort of symbol of quiet oversight, a man who couldn't change the system but measured it anyway, and in doing so, gave men the smallest form of justice, the truth of their daily bread. At Depot 19B, some soldiers began volunteering to help with the weighing process. A corporal named Ewan Vexley even designed a crude biscuit gauge using a piece of copper pipe, which he claimed could detect underweight rations by feel alone. Snelling noted the invention in his ledger as supplementary weighing implement, non-regulation but functional. Yet despite these improvements, the fundamental problem remained. Biscuit weight varied, and the supply chain was indifferent to nuance. And so, Snelling made his boldest move yet. The memorandum that went too far. In late August 1901, Snelling drafted a formal memorandum to the Army Provisioning Committee in London, complete with annexes, weight tables, and 12 hand-drawn biscuit cross-sections. His proposal was straightforward. Establish a standardized Army biscuit weight enforcement office, tasked with sampling and rejecting shipments that fell below acceptable thresholds. It was, by all accounts, an unusual suggestion, especially coming from a second clerk stationed in a minor depot 6,000 miles away. The response when it came was terse. The biscuit is a non-critical item in rations. Texture, weight, and variability are expected in the field. Your attention to detail is noted but unwarranted. Snelling, unfazed, pasted the response into his ledger and underlined the phrase non-critical 3 times in red ink. He continued his measurements, continued logging, continued weighing. And eventually others followed. A depot in Kimberley began submitting their own biscuit weights. A sergeant in Mafeking wrote to Snelling personally, including a biscuit fragment and the message: "This is what we're calling a full 12. Care to compare?" A quiet, grassroots system of accountability had begun, not enforced from above, but formed in the spaces between rules, shared among men who had little power but plenty of time. Meanwhile in London. Back in England, the war's unpopularity grew. Papers reported not on biscuits, but on scorched earth tactics, prisoner camps, and the rising cost of a war with no end. But in the ledgers ignored and unread in most offices, Snelling's campaign lived on. At the end of his 3rd month of measuring, he summarized his findings. Of 127 crates opened between July and September, only 22 delivered full-weight biscuits as labeled. The average loss across all crates is 1.14 ounces per ration per day. Across 300 men over 90 days, this amounts to over 2,000 rations worth of biscuit weight never received. No reply ever came. No reforms were made. But in Depot 19B, the men began issuing supplemental tea rations for underweight biscuits, a practice not approved but rarely questioned. And across the veldt, as supplies came and went, biscuit crates were now inspected more carefully, quietly, systematically, not by order but by example. And so a simple question remained, never quite answered. If a biscuit weighs less than it should, but the ledger says it does, which do you believe, the scale or the system? By the final months of 1901, the war in South Africa was waning, at least in energy, if not in action. Troop movements slowed. Boer fighters dispersed into scattered bands, and the British military, burdened by long supply lines and political fatigue, shifted its focus to containment and paperwork. Back at Depot 19B, Quartermaster Hubert Snelling sat at his folding desk, surrounded by rows of stacked biscuit crates and half-used ink pots. The wind kicked dust under the canvas flaps. Outside, mules shuffled. Inside, Snelling updated his ledgers. He had just completed day 143 of recorded biscuit weights. His charts were now dense with patterns, bars, curves, averages, percentages. He had named his weighing scale Verity, and on the last page of his most recent volume, he wrote a short observation. It is not the hunger that causes unrest, but the sense that no one is counting properly. Biscuit standardization by example. Though Snelling's official memo had been dismissed by the provisioning committee, his methods had quietly traveled. Across depots in Colesberg, Ladysmith, and Kimberley, supply clerks began incorporating biscuit weighing into their routines, not out of regulation, but out of professional curiosity, respect for precision, or simply to have something to do in a war that had become a waiting game. Some even copied Snelling's ledger format. Others began sending biscuit fragments through internal post, clearly labeled with weight and date as informal samples. One such piece, mailed to Snelling from a supply station near the Modder River, arrived wrapped in newspaper and accompanied by a note. This one we nicknamed the Ghost, broke apart before it landed. 9.6 Oz, tell Verity hello. Snelling filed it under unclassifiables, then weighed it anyway. The end of the affair. The war formally ended in May 1902, and Depot 19B was scheduled for decommissioning. Troops were rotated out. Crates were burned, buried, or shipped north. Snelling, who had now become something of a minor legend among logistics staff, was offered transfer to Pretoria or return to London. He chose neither. Instead, he requested reassignment to Cape Town docks, where he could oversee departing shipments. His reason, simply stated, I would prefer to weigh things that are leaving for a change. His request was granted. Before he left 19B, Snelling packed his ledger's 6 thick volumes and 1 supplemental appendix into a wooden crate, labeled Biscuits, Administrative, Not for Consumption. The crate was shipped with him and placed beside his bunk aboard a transport vessel. At Cape Town, Snelling was assigned to a supply tent facing the sea. There, he resumed his work less intensely now, more reflectively. He noted biscuit weights less frequently but still made records. He began cataloging tin condition, boot leather stiffness, and the thickness of paper used in army forms. He had become, in his own quiet way, the archivist of the overlooked. A legacy without a name. In 1903, back in London, the Army Provisioning Committee reviewed an internal report on supply inconsistencies during the war. Among dozens of pages was a short reference to a field ledger experiment involving biscuit weight analysis. The recommendation was brief. Where feasible, depots should maintain basic rations weight logs to ensure minimum thresholds are consistently met. No name was cited, no clerk credited. But within 2 years, biscuit production contracts were revised. Labels began to include minimum net weight in clearer print. Spot inspections were authorized for overseas shipments. And so Snelling's work ignored when loud was adopted when quiet. Not through recognition, but through absorption. His vigilance became procedure. His insistence on ounces became policy. The system, slowly, had changed because one man refused to let the numbers go unmeasured. The final ledger entry. Snelling retired in 1909. He returned to London, where he kept a modest flat and volunteered twice a week at a municipal archive, helping index war records. He was, by all accounts, content. When he died in 1920, aged 63, his personal belongings included a single wooden crate. Inside were all 6 biscuit ledgers from Depot 19B, one iron scale labeled Verity, a sealed tin of biscuits marked Portsmouth Supply, Oct 1901, and a note handwritten unsigned. The weight of a thing is not what it is, but what it is supposed to be. And when we stop measuring, we forget what fairness feels like. The crate, placed in storage at the War Office for decades, was rediscovered in 1978 during a building relocation. The ledgers were preserved. The tin, still sealed, was placed in the Imperial War Museum, where it remains unopened but labeled. Biscuit, British Army Field Ration, see 1901 Ledger Standard. And so ends the tale of a war clerk who fought no battle, commanded no men, and never raised his voice, but who noticed what no one else would weigh. Story 7. The Dutch Tulip Smugglers and the Secret Bulb Codes. In the year 1636, the Dutch Republic was many things: a naval power, a merchant empire, a land reclaimed from sea, and briefly and bizarrely the global center of tulip speculation. This period, later called Tulip Mania, saw the price of a single bulb of certain rare varieties, particularly the exquisitely variegated ones, reach sums greater than the cost of a canal house in Amsterdam. While economic historians still debate whether this truly qualifies as a bubble in the modern sense, what is beyond dispute is that, for a short, feverish time, tulip bulbs were treated as treasure. But as in all gold rushes, where there is value, there is smuggling. And among the narrow lanes of Haarlem and the shipping docks of Leiden, a small but persistent undercurrent of illicit activity took root, not in crates or ships, but in ledgers, contracts, and whispered codes passed between gloved hands and candle-lit counting rooms. This is the story of the bulb coders, a ring of merchants, clerks, and growers who developed an entire covert system of tracking, trading, and moving rare tulip bulbs outside the laws of guilds, customs, and taxation. The value of dirt. To understand why this system emerged, one must appreciate the strange nature of the tulip bulb itself. Unlike gold or spices, a tulip bulb was a living organism, fragile, seasonal, and subject to time. It could not be reliably stored or moved year-round. Bulbs were only dug up after their growing season, usually in early summer, and then traded during the dormant months, typically September to January. But the most prized bulbs, like the Semper Augustus, with its vivid white petals streaked with crimson, were rare to the point of myth. Many were infected with a benign virus, later understood to be the mosaic virus, that caused their dramatic color breaking, but also made them more difficult to propagate. Thus, ownership of a single viable bulb could confer enormous power, provided one could protect, trade, or replicate it. And so, as prices climbed, restrictions tightened. The tulip guilds in cities like Haarlem and Alkmaar imposed controls on the trade. Only approved merchants could sell certain varieties. Growers were taxed. Export required documentation. Bulbs were labeled, counted, monitored. Yet still bulbs vanished, and new, rare varieties surfaced in places they should not have been. A contradiction emerged. The ledgers said one thing, but the gardens said another. That was where the codes came in. The birth of bulb ciphers. In early 1636, a minor clerk at the Alkmaar Tulip Exchange named Jans Veltman made an odd discovery. While reviewing inventory records from 2 neighboring tulip farms, he found duplicate entries for a bulb called Generalissimo Rubens, both claiming to possess the only known bulb of that name. Curious, He examined the physical bulbs themselves and found something stranger still. Both bore the same exact variegation. Further investigation led nowhere. The bulbs had been acquired via a broker and recorded with proper stamps. But in the margin of one farmer's ledger, Jans noted a small symbol, herb followed by the number 13421. He found a similar mark in another ledger, but this time with 11359. The symbols were consistent, but the numbers varied. The clerk began searching other ledgers. Within weeks, he uncovered at least 17 such markings, always associated with rare bulbs and never corresponding to the public records. They appeared only in personal farm logs, merchant notebooks, and marginalia of exchanged letters. They were not part of the official tulip record. They were something else. Veltman had stumbled onto an invisible market. The function of the code. Historians now believe the numbers were a multi-part cipher used to describe the bulb's variety through a numbered list known only to insiders. Its grade, viability, maturity, and break of color. Its value in gulden, rounded down to coded base. The location or broker associated with the bulb. But unlike most smuggling operations, the bulb coders were not moving illegal goods across borders. They were duplicating inventory, disguising ownership, and creating a shadow registry that bypassed guild controls and taxes. Bulbs were sold on paper months before they were dug. Payments were deferred. Speculators bought options on bulbs they had never seen. To the public, the trade was confined to recorded auctions. But in the margins, a secret pre-sale system emerged. Buyers would receive a slip of paper, folded and sealed, bearing only a single plant icon and a sequence of numbers. If one knew the code, it told you everything: which bulb you had bought, how much you had paid, where to collect it, and whom to bribe. If you didn't know the code, it was just numbers. Some ledgers even contained counterfeit entries, bulbs deliberately recorded as destroyed or dormant, even as they were sold covertly elsewhere. The bulb existed twice, once in dirt and once in ledger shadow. Authorities react too slowly. By the end of 1636, suspicions grew. A sudden spike in sales of rare bulbs in Rotterdam raised eyebrows, especially when some of those bulbs had supposedly been lost to frost earlier that year. In January 1637, the Haarlem Guild attempted a crackdown. Inspectors were dispatched. Several growers were fined. One ledger was confiscated and found to contain over 40 coded entries, none of which matched public records. But the problem was systemic. The codes had spread faster than enforcement. As a contemporary observer wrote, "The bulbs, it seems, are buried not only in soil but in paper, under symbols no one admits to writing." The collapse of tulip mania in February 1637 came as swiftly as it had risen. Prices plummeted, fortunes evaporated, contracts were reneged, speculators disappeared. But even in the aftermath, the bulb codes remained. They had outlived the mania. For in a world where price could no longer be trusted, only the coded records remained to say who had ever truly owned what. In February 1637, the bottom dropped out. Auctions were canceled. Buyers refused to pay. Contracts for bulbs never even seen, let alone planted, were voided in taverns with a wave of the hand. The paper tulips of Amsterdam and Haarlem evaporated, leaving behind a tangle of ledgers, IOUs, and promises written in code. But the collapse did not simply destroy fortunes. It exposed them. And in doing so, the coded underworld of bulb smuggling and silent ledgers began to surface in strange and quiet ways. The quiet debts of Haarlem. One such case involved a prominent Haarlem spice merchant named Pieter Klees, who had invested heavily in rare tulip bulbs during the final months of the boom. According to public records, he had purchased only modest quantities, perhaps 6 bulbs of middling value. But when Cleese declared bankruptcy that spring, creditors discovered a hidden notebook bound in calfskin, tucked inside a drawer beneath his writing desk. It was not labeled. Inside were pages of columned numbers with small botanical sketches in the margins. Lines, arrows, and symbols always the same format. Tulip 12741. Cherry Blossom 09362. Leaf fluttering in wind 15524. To the untrained eye, it resembled some sort of agricultural inventory. But when compared to actual bulb stock at his garden plots, the numbers didn't add up. The bulbs weren't there. In fact, they'd never been there. Cleese, like many others, had bought paper rights to bulbs through off-ledger arrangements, most of them through intermediaries who used the now familiar four-part code. These weren't real bulbs. They were units of trust, tied to no central registry, traded hand-to-hand in candle-lit taverns and back rooms. For the receivers of such contracts, the meaning was clear. 12741 might mean variety, Viceroy. Grade, mature, viable. Value, 400 gulden. Pickup location, Blomendal grower via broker 1. Cleese had believed the codes represented actual, physical bulbs. He was wrong. In the post-mania haze, no one knew what was real anymore, and that was the power and peril of the bulb code. A growing archive of ghosts. In the wake of the crash, municipal councils ordered inventories of disputed bulb transactions. Some guilds cooperated, others refused, but one constant emerged. Across dozens of cities, coded transactions appeared in ledgers, letters, private notes, and contracts. A secret language had spread not through any single conspiracy, but through shared incentives. Clerks, growers, and brokers had created a parallel system because it allowed for flexibility. Bulbs could be pre-sold without full disclosure. Brokers could take commissions quietly. Growers could avoid guild quotas and taxes. And now, with the market deflated, these coded records remained undeniable but unenforceable. Legal proceedings stalled. Courts were unable to interpret codes. No one admitted to authoring the ledgers. But in private, among traders and clerks, the bulb code lived on as a tool not for speculation anymore, but for memory. A small group of record keepers began compiling them, mapping the code language, as one might map dialects or bird calls. Among them was a former legal scribe named Maria Elshout, who had worked as an assistant in the Alkmaar Tulip Guild until its closure. Between 1638 and 1641, she compiled a manuscript titled On the Transitory Nature of Botanical Property and the Marks by which it is Denied. Only one copy survives, now housed in the Leiden University Library. It contains 28 pages of cipher key theories, bulb code variants, and anecdotal accounts from growers who admitted to using the system. Her conclusion was not bitter, but practical. When value exceeds the object, the symbol becomes king. What we traded were not bulbs, but beliefs. Bulb hunters and the problem of provenance. In the years following the crash, a new type of merchant emerged, the bulb hunter. These were individuals often from France or the German states who scoured Dutch markets looking to acquire orphaned bulbs. Those whose ownership was unclear, disputed, or coded into anonymity. Many of these bulbs had been smuggled or duplicated in secret during the height of tulip mania. Now, with prices normalized and oversight weakened, they could be purchased cheaply. But the problem remained: how to verify a bulb's identity. Enter the ghost ledgers. These were unofficial books passed between growers and trusted traders, some dating back to 1635, that contained handwritten descriptions, sketches, and yes, coded entries for rare bulbs. Though never acknowledged publicly, these ghost ledgers became a kind of black market provenance system analogous to art certification centuries later. One particularly detailed ghost ledger from Leiden contained the following entry. Hibiscus 14532 alias, the Night Flame, origin Haarlem grower deceased, split in 37, surviving bulb planted Blomendal passed to broker H with 1/3 share held. These records were used not to claim value in court, but to negotiate ownership quietly. In this way, the code did not die. It merely changed its purpose from concealment to certification. A legacy in the margins. By 1650, the Dutch tulip market had stabilized. Prices returned to sensible levels. The guilds, battered and restructured, now allowed freer trade among recognized members. And yet, many older growers, especially those who had survived the mania, still kept dual ledgers. The official one, neat and proper, and the other, coded, erratic and tucked inside coat linings or hollowed books. Why? Perhaps it was habit. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a belief that not all value can or should be written plainly. As one elderly grower wrote in 1654, "There are flowers in this world so rare that to name them is to lose them. So we write in symbols and let the wise read." By the end of the 17th century, tulips had found their proper place in the Dutch Republic. No longer a fevered commodity, nor a source of whispered ruin, the flower had become what it had been before the mania, an object of careful beauty, cultivated in neat garden beds, admired in seasonal displays, and sold this time within the bounds of guilds and paperwork. But the codes, they did not fade as easily. In fact, in quiet ways, they began to evolve. From smugglers to stewards. By 1675, the Dutch tulip market had matured. The largest growers, like those in Haarlem, Leiden, and Utrecht, operated with detailed planting calendars, shipping manifests, and formal registries. Yet some families, particularly those descended from growers active during the 1630s, continued to maintain private ledgers that contained not just botanical notes, but also coded annotations, some carried forward nearly word for word from the days of the crash. One notable example was the Van Diepenbeek ledger, held by a tulip-growing family in Sassenheim. Spanning nearly 70 years, it recorded the lineage of bulbs across 3 generations. Among its notations were entries such as Tulip 13653 last viable in 49, replanted West Field, await outcome. Fallen Leaf 09241, trade sealed with G in secret, no guild declaration. Dove 15974, name erased by request. These were not smugglers. These were archivists, protecting a knowledge system that had once defied oversight and now lived as a private history less about profit, more about provenance. Just as a winemaker may know the slope on which a grapevine once grew, these growers kept the bloodlines of flowers alive through quiet record-keeping, and at times, still through symbols. The codes had become a cultural inheritance, carried not for concealment but for meaning. A language passed in silence. What's most remarkable is how far the bulb codes reached beyond the Netherlands, across Europe, into entirely new domains. In the archives of the Bibliothèque Mazarine in Paris, a 1683 manuscript titled De Codex Florum contains examples of French adaptations of the bulb cipher. These were used in the Versailles garden trades, where nobles exchanged exotic plants and seeds often as gifts, but sometimes as disguised debts. One entry reads, Hibiscus 08473 recovered from Dutch envoy to be stored with caution. Return not advised. What began as smuggling evolved into a shared language of horticultural confidentiality, a way for individuals to track what was rare, delicate, or politically sensitive without exposing it to open scrutiny. Even in the early 18th century, British horticulturists exchanging rare specimens from the Netherlands used cipher-like annotations in their journals. Most weren't precise bulb codes, but the practice had inspired a genre of cautious record-keeping, marking what must be known, but not declared. The Museum of the Forgotten Petal. In 1887, during renovations at a canal house in Leiden, a small wooden box was discovered behind a wall panel. Inside were two desiccated tulip bulbs wrapped in cloth, along with a leather-bound booklet. The booklet, now preserved in the Rijksmuseum's rare manuscripts collection, contains a simple title, Voor de Stilte, for the silence. Within are 63 entries, each a flower icon followed by a number code, and a short line of poetry or proverb. The handwriting suggests it was written by a woman, likely a member of a grower's family, between 1640 and 1650. Entry 21 reads, Blossom 10641, only in the dark does the root remember the sun. Entry 58 reads, Herb 12793, what is rare is not the bloom, but the hand that did not sell it. It is unknown whether this booklet was a trade record, a ledger, or a kind of floral diary, encoded with personal meaning. But what is clear is that the bulb code, born in commercial shadow, had taken on a poetic second life. It had become a way of remembering what mattered, whether it was a debt unpaid, a flower unseen, or a promise made between growers in a time when trust could not be written plainly. Echoes in modern times. Even today, tulip enthusiasts and historical botanists occasionally discover coded notations in antique plant books, trading slips, and estate inventories. Most are unreadable, some are misinterpreted, but all suggest a continuity of knowledge that has never been fully broken. In 2007, a Dutch university-led project attempted to decode all known bulb cipher variants from the 1630s and 40s. The result was an incomplete lexicon of nearly 300 symbol number combinations. It remains an academic curiosity, but also a reminder that in history, value is not always visible, that some systems live longer than the markets that create them, and that the real smuggling in the end was not of bulbs but of belief, trust, and memory through uncertain times.